Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's episode eventually gets us to hidden treasure and self-playing harps. But, as always, we have to get there. In this week's Torah portion, Parshas Behaalosecha, one of the things that we learn about is trumpets. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, or Moses, Behaalosecha shtei chatzotzros, make for yourself 2 trumpets. And then it goes on and tells us the different ways that those trumpets should be used to gather the people and at special times, and it also tells us the specific signals used for different types of messages. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, and at one point I was considering following those signals and going down that rabbit hole. But what ended up getting my attention even more was the trumpets themselves. On that verse where the trumpets are introduced, when God tells Moses, make for yourself trumpets, there's actually a lot of commentary in Midrashim. In fact, Rashi has 3 different things to say just about those 2 words, Behaalosecha, make for yourself. First of all, he says that the trumpets are for yourself, for Moshe, because they would blow the trumpets for him, like a king. Then Rashi gives us another interpretation of make for yourself, and says that it means that Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to use his own money, or his own silver, to make those trumpets, and not use common funds. So they weren't communal trumpets, they were Moshe Rabbeinu's personal trumpets. And then Rashi gives us one more interpretation, and says, make for yourself means that only Moshe Rabbeinu could use them, and not anybody else. So this idea that these trumpets were Moshe's personal trumpets in various different ways caught my attention. And when I dug a little bit deeper, I found that a lot of commentaries mention this in various different ways. But the way Chizkuni presented it is what got me hooked. He says for yourself means for your needs, so that he wouldn't need to send people out to find trumpets when he needed them. And for some reason, that's the one that made it feel the most personal for me, like these are Moshe's personal trumpets. Like my special jar of peanut butter that I keep on the top shelf of the cupboard that is not for school lunches. I guess the reason why the idea of Moshe's personal trumpets was particularly interesting to me is because Moshe Rabbeinu is such a huge looming figure in Torah and in Judaism. We know a lot about him, his unique leadership qualities and the miracles that he performed for the Jews, and we also know about some of his challenges, for example, his speech impediment. So we do know a lot about him, but I feel like we don't usually hear about his stuff, his personal effects, the things that he owned and perhaps valued.
What if we found Moses' shoes, Ezzy?
We know about the staff of Moses, which I explored in a previous rabbit hole, but I can't think of any other examples of things that belonged to and were perhaps important to Moshe. But then we have these trumpets that were only for him to use, and he always had them available just for him. So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with Moses' special personal trumpets. If you're ready to see where that leads, let's dive in. Okay, so this whole idea of Moshe's personal trumpets that's mentioned in the commentaries originates in Midrash. It says that make for yourself means that nobody else can use them. And then it gives us another detail that Rashi didn't include, that even Yeshua, or Joshua, Moses' successor as leader of the Jewish people, even he wasn't allowed to use the trumpets. And the proof that the Midrash gives for that is that when Yeshua sieged Jericho, the verse says that they blew shofars, shofar horns, and the walls of Jericho fell and they conquered the city. So according to the Midrash, this illustrates that Yeshua used shofars for military purposes and not the trumpets.
Come down here! Larry, get down here!
So according to this, even Moshe's direct successor didn't get to use the trumpets. So what happened to those trumpets? The Midrash tells us that they were hidden away before Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. And the proof that the Midrash brings for that is that towards the end of Chumash, when Moshe gathers the Jewish people before his death, he says, gather to me all the elders of the tribes. And the Midrash asks, where were the trumpets? In other words, why did Moshe tell people to gather everybody and not just blow the trumpets? And the answer is because they were already hidden away. Then the Midrash adds that the reason why that had to happen on the day Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, and not afterwards, was because of a verse in Behaalosecha, or Ecclesiastes, that says that there is no rulership on the day of death. Okay, so there are a few things about this Midrash that I want to talk about. First of all, I just found the imagery of that day to be really powerful. That verse from Behaalosecha that says that there's no rulership on the day of death is normally interpreted to mean that even the most powerful people have no power over death. But here, as applied to the missing trumpets on the day Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, it seems to be playing out more literally, that all the bells and whistles and trappings of leadership were stripped away. And it creates this feeling of loss and silence that I find really powerful. But probably the most exciting thing here is that the trumpets were hidden. I dug around to try and see if I could find any sources that mention them being found ever, but I couldn't find anything, which begs the question, are the trumpets of Moses still out there? Are they buried in the desert somewhere? And most importantly, why was there never an Indiana Jones and the Trumpets of Moses?
Well, things can't always be the way you want them to be. Sometimes they are.
But there's one more thing that I think is interesting about all of this, which is that there clearly were trumpets used by the Jewish people after the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah tells us pretty clearly in this week's Parshah that we're supposed to use trumpets at various times, and there are countless references to trumpets being used in the Beis HaMikdash, the temple. I saw different sources deal with this in different ways, but the simplest explanation is just that there were different trumpets used for that. Which makes this idea that Yeshua didn't use the trumpets at all even more interesting. He could have used his own trumpets, which suggests that there was something uniquely trumpety about Moshe's leadership, and Yeshua's leadership was different. In fact, the Midrash, a little further on in its discussion of the trumpets, brings up the trumpets that were used later, and says that the trumpets could only be used by Moshe because he was a king, and the only other person who could use them was David HaMelech, or King David. And some commentaries explain that this means all of the kings who were descended from David HaMelech could use them. But then the Midrash continues and tells us that even though trumpets were used by kings later on, starting with the time of David HaMelech, Rav points out that David HaMelech himself very famously used a harp. The word is kinor, which actually has a lot of translations, and which I actually discussed in the very first Parshah rabbit hole. I think the most accurate translation would be lyre, but I'm just going to say harp.
What's up, Doc?
Anyways, it's a pretty famous thing that David HaMelech played the harp. But the Midrash actually illustrates this idea that David played a harp by telling us about a harp that he didn't play. It says that David HaMelech had a harp that hung over his bed, and at midnight every night the north wind would blow and cause the harp to play on its own. I guess kind of like wind chimes. Anyways, that would wake him up, and then he and his students would learn Torah until dawn. So there's a lot of confusing twists here. Nobody was allowed to use the trumpets except for Moshe Rabbeinu, but also except for David HaMelech because of a verse about a different king, but also David didn't play the trumpet, he played the harp, as we see from a story about how the wind played the harp and not David HaMelech. So besides for being kind of confused, the main thing I came away with from this Midrash was wondering why the Midrash makes this musical distinction between Moshe and David. Kind of like the distinction already made between Moshe and Yeshua, but now we have another instrument in the mix. So I looked at the commentaries on that Midrash, and I didn't find an answer. I did, however, find an interesting explanation of the self-playing harp. The commentary Yedei Moshe connects this to a piece from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer that says that the strings of David HaMelech's harp were made from the sinews of the ram that Avram Avinu, or Abraham, sacrificed instead of his son Yitzchak, or Isaac. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer explains that each part of that animal ended up being used for various different important things throughout Jewish history, including the sinews, which ended up being used as the strings of David HaMelech's harp. So, based on this commentary says that since the ram was a sacrifice, and a sacrifice can't intentionally be used for any other purpose, then it could only be used in a way where it would play on its own without a human being directly causing it to play. So this doesn't really connect to all the trumpet stuff, but I just thought it was cool to take this already weird thing about a self-playing harp and connect it all the way back to this very weird moment at the beginning of Jewish history. But I was still wondering about the connections between Moshe, Yeshua, and David and their respective musical instruments. So I expanded the search radius a little and dug around for anything that mentioned Moshe's trumpets and David's harp in the same place. And I found something in Rabbeinu Bachya's commentary on our Parshah, which I guess I missed the first time around when I was looking at all the commentaries on those trumpets. He has a Kabbalistic explanation of how Moshe Rabbeinu used the two trumpets to channel the two opposing emotional attributes of Rachamim and Din, compassion and judgment. or something like that. Honestly, I didn't completely understand it. But then he says that Yeshua couldn't reach that level, and he used the shofar to channel only the quality of judgment, which was his primary quality. And he continues that David used the harp, which he connects to the attribute of Malchus, which literally means kingship, but in Jewish mysticism there's a lot more to it. And again, honestly, I didn't completely understand all the Kabbalah stuff. But that's okay, because it's really the next part that I was excited about. He wraps all of this up by saying that each and every person has their own instrument that fits their specific level of understanding, prophecy, and emotional qualities. So I got my confirmation that there is indeed something uniquely trumpety about Moshe Rabbeinu, and something uniquely shofari about Yeshua, and something uniquely harpy about David HaMelech. I don't understand what it is, but it's confirmed. But the thing that was really cool to me is this idea that everybody has their own instrument. It could be that he specifically meant the heroes and leaders in Jewish history, because he did mention prophecy, but he doesn't say that specifically. He just says kol echad ve'echad, each individual. So I'd like to think that this applies to everyone. And there are probably ways to expand this beyond musical instruments and say that this applies to any type of tool that enables a person to express Torah, but I'm cool with it just being musical instruments. I like the idea that every single person, even those of us like myself who don't consider ourselves musicians, we still each have a musical instrument that we have a special connection to. Mine is the tuba. Like I said, I'm not a musician, but the tuba is still mine. Not literally, that tuba belonged to the school district and I had to give it back, and tubas cost like thousands of dollars, so I don't have a tuba anymore. But I still do have a tuba in my heart. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if you have any questions or cool things you know about this topic, put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. To find your way out, follow the sound of the trumpets. But they might just lead you down even deeper.